Okay, let's get started. This is Quic, and this is our second session for the week. If someone come in the back door could possibly close it, that'd be really appreciated. Thank you. Or we can get the next person to close it. Okay. This is the note well. Good morning, by the way. This is the note well. Hopefully you're all familiar with it. If you're not, you can find it using your favorite search engine by searching for IETF note well. It's the terms under which we participate regarding things like intellectual property, but also regarding things like our behavior in the room and on the mailing lists and in the hallways and other IETF-ish places. So please take a look. Please learn more about it. If you have any questions, we'd love to chat with you, either myself, Lars when he's here, he sends his regards, or other IETF leadership. Blue sheets are circulating, one on each side. Please sign those as they come by. Can we have some volunteers or a volunteer for scribing? 2 hours for which you will be eternally thanked. It's amazing how quiet the room can become. I won't ask Ted Hardy because he's done so much service in the past. Are you volunteering? Ted, your service to the community is above and beyond. Thank you. Thank you, Ted. Are you going to use the Etherpad, Ted, or the Google Doc? Etherpad? If folks could help Ted out on the Etherpad, if you're not actually helping Ted out, maybe refrain from getting onto it because it doesn't like lots of people at the same time. That would be appreciated. Can someone volunteer to Jabber scribe, a significantly easier task? Thank you, DKG. Once again, we're not entirely sure the bridge from Jabber to Slack is working, so please bias towards Jabber. Agenda bashing. Our agenda today, we're going to continue discussion of the issues. I think we're in a place where we can discuss just the HTTP and recovery issues today. We have Ecker, interrupt.
Yeah, we have one remaining transport issue / pull request that we didn't process yesterday.
I heard one remaining transport issue, and then I heard a lot of Ecker.
Huh?
Can you?
That we didn't process yesterday.
Which one?
Pull request 3120.
Okay, we'll start with that one.
Integrity tag.
Let me interrupt just Colin James. Would it be possible to agenda bash the swapping of datagrams and version negotiation due to some people trying to sneak to a different meeting?
Well, first of all, we're not sure when that's going to start. It depends on how much the issue discussion takes.
Totally understand.
And we've already agenda bashed yesterday that getting version negotiation before the other two was important. So
my question still remains. Is there a reason not to? It was just a question. Yes or no would be fine.
Any objection to that?
I think that'd be fine. I think we'll have time.
Okay. Any other agenda bash? Sorry, I didn't even finish the agenda. So we're going to finish talking about issues, including that. Talk about extension documents. Apparently we'll talk about datagrams first, then version negotiation, then load balancers. And we'll end up with planning. Any other agenda bashing?
Praveen.
Sorry, the acoustics in this room are horrific, so everyone needs to speak very close to the mic and very distinctly.
Praveen, agenda. I think like the planning discussion should be moved up front. One of the discussion with implementers has been a request for like a quiet period where we could get some deployment experience. So I think planning, moving it up front would be very useful.
Any objection to that? Okay. Jana.
If you could I take a couple of minutes to talk about the Quic interop runner?
How about putting that at the end as time permits?
Sorry?
Can we put that at the end as time permits?
That's fine with me.
Okay. Okay. Any other agenda bashing? Okay, that's probably the most lively agenda bash we've had ever. So let's execute on that. Planning. We're going to talk about extensions and other documents later on today. And so Lars and I and the area directors have been having a number of chats about how we're going to go into the next phase of this work. As we've discussed, we currently have a call out for consensus on getting the recovery and HTTP documents into the late stage process. We are, as you can see, winnowing down the issues lists on all of the drafts, so there are very few left. And the anticipation, as we've discussed and tried to telegraph a number of times, is that the drafts are going to settle down from a technical standpoint of the bits on the wire. But we will enter a period where we think we understand, yes?
Mr. Chair, Subir, I think today is Wednesday, not Thursday.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Today is Wednesday, not Thursday, your slide.
Thank you for that. If only every issue were so easy to solve. This is what I get for chairing more than one working group and reusing slides. Right. So, good morning. I will point out I've only had one coffee this morning, and for someone where I'm from, that's not any at all. So we're hoping that the drafts will settle down from a technical standpoint. We also anticipate the editors taking that time to do some fairly substantial reworking of the documents from an editorial standpoint to make sure they're communicating clearly, not changing the technical content, but changing how it's presented so that it is readable and usable by people who haven't participated in this process. At the same time, we feel that implementers are going to need some time to digest everything that's happened, to work on their implementations, to do interop work, and also to get some deployment experience. That's something that people want to see very much before we ship the RFCs to make sure that this thing actually works in the wild. And so the tentative plan going forward is that once we get the documents into a good shape and we close these issues, we'll go to a working group last call, hopefully before the end of the year, and as a way to notify the greater community that we think we're technically done. However, we're not going to request them to become RFCs for some time after that, and very roughly speaking, that's something like the middle of next year, because we want to get that experience, give the editors a chance to work on the documents a bit, and to get deployment experience. So it may not be our last working group last call on these, and I know that dissonance is harsh for some, but it is what we think will be our working group last call. Because of that, we're going to have some capacity in the working group for discussing other things. And so we're talking about how we can start the discussion of extensions to Quic V1, and whether we start the discussion of any potential Quic V2, and also discussion of new application bindings to Quic. And in discussion amongst the chairs and the area directors, we think that the best approach is for this working group to start discussing extensions in a limited way. We don't want to have a flood of them come at us all at once, but to start a few discussions. And that's why we're starting to have things like discussion of load balancers and datagrams. Version negotiation is the third one that we're going to talk about there. And at the same time, there are other folks who want to do new applications on top of Quic, and our bias is to not do those in this working group, but instead to talk about new venues for those, or reusing existing venues. So, for example, there's a BOF, I think, later today about web transport, and that's potentially a working group forming BOF, I believe. No, not quite yet, but one may appear afterwards at some point. But we wouldn't want to do that work in this working group, is the important thing to convey. So I think that's where we're at. We have an interim scheduled in Zurich. The anticipation is that there's an interop event before that. The implementers can get good interop experience, hopefully on those working group last call documents. We'll have some discussion of any remaining issues that we need to, but we'll also have some time to talk about these extensions. Any discussion of this? Christian.
Yeah, I mean, I like the idea of stabilizing the protocol before publishing the RFC and having some time to test and verify. However, if you delay pushing the document for publication, at the same time, you're also pushing the IETF review.
Sorry, pushing the IETF?
Review.
Yes.
I mean, so basically, if you're not doing the IETF last call, you are not getting the feedback from people who are not actually in the working group. And so that creates an uncertainty about the duration of the IETF last call later on. And I'm a bit concerned about that. And I'd like to find a way to mitigate that.
Okay. I think that's a reasonable concern to have. I'd be interested to hear what other people think about it.
Praveen, I do like the idea of going to a sort of semi-formal working group last call. So I think that's a good idea. What I would like is something more concrete in terms of a draft number that we're targeting to close out the remaining issues such that implementations can deploy and stabilize on it. I think working group coming out and saying something formal would be useful instead of having a vague date-based deadline, like target a particular draft where we say, hey, we're going to freeze this for a little while so that people can deploy. I think that would be very, very useful. And regarding IETF process, I think that can go on in parallel. Like if you find any major issues from deployment, we can come back and like fix those. But I think like having a very stable draft formally declared would be very, very useful.
So, Martin Thompson, I think based on the issue list that we have in front of us and the discussion that we had here earlier this week, the next version of the draft might be that one that Praveen's looking for. I'm not 100% confident about that, but I think we should certainly try to make that the case. We have a long time between now and the interim meeting, and I think the editors are pretty firmly committed to nailing all of those issues. Most of them have pull requests against them already, so I think we're in pretty good shape for that one. As for Christian's concern, I think we have a fairly simple answer to that one. The IETF review is largely based on directorate review in the modern day, and so simply going to each of the directorates now and asking for review, which is a practice that most of the directorates already support for various things, is sufficient and will get us some wider review. And I would say that the steps that I would like to see happen are we finish the next draft, we do a working group last call on that, and then after that finishes, the chairs talk to the various directorates and ask for those reviews to happen. And that will happen during our idle period, and we can deal with the issues as they come in. But I suspect what's going to happen there is that we will have 25, and then a 26 will contain a whole bunch of editorial changes based on review and working group last call and feedback, and 27 will be directorate feedback, and then we'll sit on that. But 25 and 27 should be functionally identical. If we're changing something there, then that's a pretty high energy event. That's maybe optimistic, but that's the sort of thing that I would like to see happen.
Well, yeah, but I mean, at the same time, you cannot expect to have review from a bunch of directorates and change nothing. So it may well be that there is some substantial change, but you don't know that.
Sorry. Brian, before you speak, can you raise the microphone? I think it would benefit everyone. Thank you.
Hi, Brian Trammell. Yeah, I basically came up here to say what Martin said. I'll expand on that very slightly. There's even a button in the data tracker now, I think, to request directorate review from a directorate on a certain thing.
There
right?
is, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, you just click the button. If there's further, like, I think that gets us exactly what we want. If there is further, like discomfort that maybe the entire community, like, there are like whole areas that aren't in this room. So, like, maybe there are people who want wider review. I know that we do not generally use IETF at IETF.org for technical discussion, but there is a mailing list that we can say, hi, by the way, you know, maybe you've heard we're like replacing TCP with TCP2. Sorry. Yeah. It's like last call coming up, right? Like, so last call preview. Can we actually send that to last call at IETF.org? I mean, we can also send it to, yeah. I mean, Yeah, so it's like almost last call, but it's like, preview last call. Please start reading the document now. It's big and important. Yeah, so I mean, like we have like I think we have a lot of options here to pipeline this, and I think what I'm hearing is that everyone here is interested in pipelining it, and I think that's a good idea.
Hi, this is Sean Turner, just driving the point home. We kind of have some running code. We did this with TLS 1.3. I don't know that we did it perfectly, but you can tell the ADs talk. You can request the early reviews. You can send the messages to everybody. You can Twitter it. You can be like, look, this is coming. If you want your chance, here's the GitHub repo. Knock yourself out. I mean, there are ways that we can do this. I do not think we should try to let the RFC go early, because we're going to end up changing it anyways. We know that, right? There's like an NDSS conference in January, so like stuff can pop up. So my theory is just do your plan.
Mostly what Sean said, you can obviously do all those things, and people will still show up at the last minute and say they don't like it. I think we have that running code as well. I think this generally seems like a solid plan. I'm probably the person who thinks that calling it last call when we know it's like not the last call is pretty silly. No, it's not a bike shed. Thanks, David. And the reason it's not a bike shed is that often there's a presumption when we do a last call that if issues are not raised in the last call, then they're out of order when they're raised later. And so I think Praveen's entirely right that it's good to have a last call. Let's try to flesh out as many of these issues as we can, and like then we'll spend some time, doing testing and doing experimentation, and that will no doubt turn up some things we'll have to change, and those issues will obviously be in order. But what also needs to be in order is, upon reflection, having looked at this longer, not from data, but from looking at this longer, there are things which are not good, which we can start changing them. My point is that they're still in order at that point in the process where they would not be in order ordinarily if, like, you were sitting in the working group for 2 years with your last call, and like you raised it like an IETF last call, people think you were a jerk. And so I'm just that's the reason you're hearing resistance from the last call.
David Skenazy, Google. Just wanted to quickly say this is a good plan. I like it, especially from our implementation side of things. The past couple of years have really felt like running after a moving target, because we're like, we have Quic. Oh, they changed the header format. All right, run, change that. Oh, they changed this. And we're almost there now. And so this quiet period is going to allow us to actually catch the target and actually put it in production and get numbers that we'll share with the group. So I think this is a great plan.
That'll be great.
Jana Engar, a clarification question. Are we talking about last call for all the documents? Are we talking about some of them? Which
Jana,
ones?
once again, you're reading my mind. I was going to bring up when the queue drained. Implicit in these discussions, I think, that everyone's assuming, I think, but I want to confirm, is that we're going to do all 4 documents at the same time, or really all 5 documents at the same time. Do you dispute that?
I think that's all right.
Okay.
I just want to point out that we've not yet moved, just in terms of process, we've not even moved those ones, HTTP and recovery documents, to the late stage process. But
sure, and that's something we're going to talk about briefly today. There's already a call for consensus out for that, and of course that's an internal process. It's not an external facing process. So. The other documents we haven't talked about very much at all are the ops and management documents. We do need to start talking about those more.
Yeah. So Martin Thompson, I was going to talk about those two specifically. This quiet period will allow them to catch up as well, because like those people implementing, chasing the moving target has been difficult for those documents, and I think it's probably a good idea to allow that to settle. It might be then that we can publish all 7 documents at the same time, which would be a really nice thing to be able to do.
So we all understand the plan. The plan will meet battle, and we'll have some fun. Yes, planning is important. One of the important takeaways that people should have here is that if you do think you have an extension that's generic, not specific to an application, that you'd like to propose for Quic, write a draft, bring it to our attention. We'll reserve time for it. If it sees some discussion on the list, we'll think about whether we want to adopt it, and then we're going to start that mechanism going. But this working group will we think be the locus of that. And one thing I should mention, I'll put an email on the list shortly if we do that, and I think this is, from talking to the area directors, the direction we want to go in. We're going to need to make a charter change. Our charter currently says, "Thou shalt not work on a datagram extension." Whoops. So we need a slight charter. Okay, that's not them, that's me. We'll need a slight charter change to enable us to work on those extensions. We'll put a proposal out for comment. The area directors will change the charter, do whatever they need to do, and we'll move forward. There are other parts of the charter we could change, but I don't think we're going to try and do that quite yet. So let's talk about issues. Ecker, you said there was one remaining issue from transport. What issue number was that?
I can talk to that one.
Okay.
So as the author of the PR for it.
Sorry, what's the issue number? Sorry?
Ecker says 3120.
No, that's 3130. And it may not be 3120 either, but.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
All right, so this is the PR, and I guess the issue is 3014. We can talk about them. I didn't see them. Okay, so let me summarize this. So first, thanks Kazuho for finding this issue. In short, most packets in Quic are encrypted, and in particular, they're integrity protected. And what this kind of a nice side effect of the crypto, but what it also means is that if you get a random bit flip on the network, it's the same as an attack, but we detect it and we drop the packet. One exception, though, is retry packets. Those, unlike initial, don't have any kind of protection. And if the retry token gets a bit flip on it, we don't notice, especially if the UDP checksum is disabled. That's particularly bad because if the retry token isn't valid, the server will reply with a second retry, and according to the spec, the client must not do that dance a second time. So then the connection is dead in the water. So the quick and simple fix that we agreed to in Cupertino was to add an integrity tag at the end. So if there's any kind of error on that, we detect it and we drop the packet. Then if you switch over to my PR, the proposal is to do exactly that. It also has a slight thing where it uses a pseudo header similar to how TCP computes its checksum, so that some fields don't need to be sent over the wire anymore. They're just added as part of the checksum. In particular, the original destination connection ID. And that's really all there is to it. One more last point was we were wondering what hash algorithm or / checksum to use here. And in order to not add any dependencies on the protocol, we decided to use GMAC because everyone already has an AES GCM implementation for initial packets. So yeah, right there, perfect. We just reuse AD AES GCM 128. The key was initially 0, but Ecker rightfully pointed out that it might be nicer to have one that changes. And then Martin Thompson had the good idea to just reuse the initial salt from. Okay, well then get in line to say that. So we use that key. So that way it's the same for all the time. The nonce is just 0. There's no plain text, and this gives and the associated data is this entire pseudo header. And that gives us a checksum, and that's really all there is to it.
Right. So I guess 2 points. Perhaps let's take the first point first. Cryptographically, I know this is a fine point, but we shouldn't use the initial salt as the key. We should we should KDF something off the initial salt. I understand this is not I'm wave hands vigorously about how this isn't really secure anyway, but nevertheless, it's a good practice. The more substantive, I think. I see people nodding, so that's fine. It's a bit of a constant. It's a constant in any case. The issue that I think that David and I were going back and forth on is whether any of this material should be encrypted. In particular, should the retry token be encrypted? I think my claim is that encrypting it has the nice property that, like, to the extent to which there is any instruction on the retry token prevents ossification. Martin's counter argument, I believe, as I recall, was that so I think there are two arguments why you might want to. There's one argument why you might not want to do it, which is it costs an AES operation or two for the GCM computation, for the AES computation. The Martin counters, I believe, with this will be a fixed mask, so you can just XOR the fixed mask, which so there's no performance consequence really. I have two ways. There are two. Well, that's not true. There is some benefit, because it means it's quite a bit more work for someone who doesn't know the draft to be able to see the structure of data. Because you're getting XOR of something unknown. Now, what I was going to say is there are actually two ways you could go here. One way is, well, three ways. One way is the current thing where it's not encrypted at all. The second way is the fixed AES key with a fixed mask, which turns into a fixed mask. So you can, which has additional advantage, by the way, that it means you don't have to redo. It means you can use exactly the same computations you ordinarily would do for packet protection. One more thing that's worth adding is that if you were willing to accept the AES operation, then you could use either of these connection IDs as the nonce, and then you would not have a fixed mask anymore. You could use either of these connection IDs as a nonce, and then you would not have the fixed computation, but you also would have a better authentication defense.
So, David Skenazy, Google. A lot of these, I get that you have really good instincts about cryptography and that key reuse is bad and a big red flag that should just make your knee twitch. But when the key is public in the spec, the implications are a lot less interesting. And therefore, this really becomes a beauty contest, in my personal opinion. The thing you're trying to encrypt is the retry token, which the server encrypts with an actual key that is not public. So maybe we just need to say that the structure should not be visible. We already say that the retry token must be distinguishable from a new token, for example. We could have built this similar to initial, meaning that you do an HKDF based on the connection IDs, and that is better for ossification. Nick Banks was scared of that because he thinks that will have really bad performance impacts on his box that sends the retry. As Google, I don't think we care much, but that's a reasonable thing. At the end of the day, ossification of a pile of bytes that are already encrypted is not something I worry about. So from my perspective, this is a bike shed. We really need the token. We really need the integrity check at the end, but what we use for the key and if we encrypt the token is a complete bike shed. I'm totally in favor of flipping a coin and being done with this.
I'm going to cut the queue.
Praveen, I just had a clarification question. So UDP checksum is only optional for IPv4 because it's protected by the IPv4 checksum. On IPv6, it's mandatory. So my question was, are we trying to get protection for the packet beyond what's provided by the IP or UDP checksum here? I'm just trying to understand why we need to do this.
David Skenazy, you, as a client application, you do not know what IP version your packet will go over. Even if the socket you're using is IPv4, IPv6, you could have a NAT64 in the network. There are a bunch of NAT64s today where if they see an IPv6 packet with a checks party time, with a checksum, they will rewrite it to v4 and clear the checksum. So there are cases where you will not get it and you have zero control over that from the application. So I think there's really a use here.
Eric Scola, I just wanted to clarify. / respond to a point David just made. One very common way to construct tokens like this is to have a header, which indicates the key.
To the mic.
A header is indicate. Sure, thank you. Which indicates the key or the token version followed by ciphertext. So it's true that the ciphertext itself is white, is indistinguishable from random, but often there's a header which is not.
Chris Wood just commenting on something earlier, particularly what David was saying with respect to the key being public, and what Ecker was trying to encourage us to do earlier. Domain separation is a good thing, cryptographically speaking. We should derive a key from this fixed salt and use it. Let's do that. Whether or not it's encrypted, I don't have a strong preference on that. So maybe that's the bike shed.
So, Martin Thompson, I wanted to ask the question whether anyone thought this was critical in some way. I don't see any indication that people think that this is a hill worth dying on. It's just that we have a preference from some people not to have it encrypted, and preference from others that it be encrypted. One of the key observations here is that we don't want to run HKDF, and we don't want to install a different AES key, because both of those operations are expensive enough to show up in the test. And Nick had some pretty good numbers on what it costs to send retries with the full HKDF plus AES key installation, all those sorts of things. So I think we have agreement on that. But Ecker's point about the 3 points in the spectrum that we're discussing is, I think, probably what we need to look at. And that is just the integrity tag, the fixed key encryption with the way that just adding encryption in the way that Davis described, and the third option being use something from the original message, for instance, the destination connection ID, the first 8 bytes thereof, for instance, as a nonce, so that you get a different output, depending a different mask for the token. And so I think if I suggest that we just do a beauty contest on those and see what people think, because I don't think anyone's particularly concerned about one versus the other here. Oh yeah, that's a good question. Does everyone think they understand the 3 options? So it's basically no encryption, encryption with a fixed nonce, or encryption with a varying nonce based on the destination connection ID. And everyone who seems to be engaged in this discussion understands.
Kazuhoku, regarding the 3 options that Martin Thompson mentioned, I think between the first 2 options, the preference would be to go for just doing GMAC compared to doing a XOR. The reason is that, endpoints can retain a pre-generated XOR key for one initial salt, but if we are going to have multiple salts based on the versions, then it becomes increasingly difficult to pre-generate all the XOR patterns for each draft. Therefore, regarding the first 2 options, I think the first one makes more sense.
So Martin, the queue is closed. Do you have a question?
Yeah, this is a clarification question, because I realized that from MT's discussion that I don't understand. So you did comment about Nick Banks having these legitimate objections to encryption, and then you presented 2 options that were encrypted, and I'm confused.
So the thesis here is that the costs involved in Nick's experiments, yes, the costs involved in those experiments was largely due to the fact that you have to run HKDF a number of times in order to get the keys, and you have to install the AES keys. Whether when you get a new AES key, you have to run a number of operations in order to get it in a state that you can use it, and so those costs tend to dominate in these things. But the thesis is that running the AES operation to XOR those bits is very, very cheap. And when you're talking about using AES GCM, it's basically costs nothing, because you have to touch those bits anyway to get the GMAC. And so that's the thesis that we're operating on here. Now, there is a cost, but I would suggest that it's very hard to measure that because of the way that this all works.
So, Jonna, do you have a question of clarification or a point of clarification?
Question.
As long as it's a question.
It is a question. This is just piggybacking on exactly this conversation because I was confused as well. We had agreed to something in Cupertino. Does this effectively mean that the agreement remains the same? Okay.
So it sounds like this isn't quite ready to go. Do you think it'd be useful to have a hum to distinguish between those three?
Oh, I thought you'd already understood that. Yes, I want to understand from this room.
Yes,
A, B, or C, because this could drag on if we take this to the list, because it's one of those ones where it doesn't really matter, but we could discuss it forever.
Right, but we're not going to close it today. So,
any chance we could have a hum on those?
That's where I'm going. Yes, thank you. We're going to hum. We have three options. The first is no encryption. The second is encryption with a static nonce. And the third is encryption with a nonce dependent upon the destination connection ID, correct? So, hum for all three if you don't care, or hum for none.
Can I ask a clarification question? So the first is the status quo, is that correct? And the second? Oh, the first is in the PR. I apologize.
PR status quo.
I thought the first is the status quo. Okay. And the last one is basically what we do for initial encryption, right?
Okay. This is actually making me worry about this hum a little bit. The first is what's in the PR. So all these fix the problem Kazoo have found. Point one. So they're different. There's just different like colors of like fixing what Kazoo have found. The first is what's in the PR, which is to say just integrity check. Nothing's encrypted. The second is that an integrity check plus things are encrypted, but with a completely fixed key, so that basically the encryption is the same plain text will be encrypted the same way every time. The third option is an integrity check plus a form of encryption, so that you will still with a fixed key, but with a diversifying nonce, so that the same plain text will be encrypted differently each time. Those are the three options.
Just a process suggestion. I have the impression that the second option is kind of really weird. So I would like to have a first hum on eliminating the second option, because it doesn't bring anything in.
I'm sorry, what was that?
I agree.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, I mean, I first suggested it, but then when I realized about the nonce thing, I decided to like the third option better.
So then the options are no encryption or encryption with a nonce based upon the destination connection ID.
Yeah. Maybe we skip the hum on the second one. Just talk about the first and the last.
So let's try that. Unless anyone feels strongly otherwise. No. Okay. Has anyone contacted the Secretariat about the lights? Okay. I like to see you. So if you believe we should have no encryption, please hum now. And if you believe we should have encryption with a nonce based upon the destination connection ID, please hum now. It's about even, though the second one was maybe slightly louder, but I think that was due to maybe one person who's really good at this.
This is DKG. Jabber Scribe reporting 2 hums for no encryption and 1 hum for the encryption.
Okay. So this is does I guess I'd be interested to hear if anyone believes that there's a critical distinction here, whether we need to face plant on this for a technical reason, or if this is just a beauty contest.
Yeah. So Jana Ingar, I'm going to suggest maybe just asking the room if people can live with either solution, and have Skenazy actually decide based on whatever feedback he gets on the PR and move forward. Well, he's written the PR. Well, or have a coin flip.
Martin wants to coin
because
flip.
we've said this in several ways now. It's a beauty contest. Ecker said it's different colors, but you didn't use the word bike shed. But I'm suggesting that this is a bike shed and that we move on.
That's what we're trying to do. So
there are technical differences and different amounts of value. Like, I mean, it's just a matter of how you judge those. Basically, there's a question of, do you judge the performance cost of the AES versus the somewhat improved cost of the obfuscation of the encryption? That's what you're judging.
Okay. The queue is still cut. I'm not really wanting to spend much more time on this.
Right.
So do you have something short, Ian?
I had a suggestion that originally the reason we had, went for the first option, at least the interim, was due to Nick's Bank's feedback about the CPU cost. Can we get some feedback on whether like this is actually a blocker for deploying Quic, or just like kind of painful or something? I'm kind of looking at you, Praveen. Yeah, I mean, Praveen's the best person I can think of channeling it, but if otherwise, I don't really care. But
Okay.
I'm trying to,
Praveen, can you answer that?
I think like deployment wise, yeah, if crypto will add cost, right? So the question here is if you're only looking for integrity check, like then it seems overkill to me to like go with crypto. So I have a strong preference for the no crypto option.
Sorry,
I have a strong preference for the no crypto option.
for no crypto.
That's very hard to tell because it will need to be deployed and measured, right? So we only have rough measurements.
Okay, so you do have a strong preference. That's actually good to hear. If we just say no crypto, is anybody going to lie down on the road about that? Sorry, no encryption, yeah.
Yeah. So Martin Thompson, that assertion is based on an assumption that this is expensive, and we don't have those numbers. Nick produced numbers for the other thing, which was definitely much more expensive, but I don't think we can say based on just yes, crypto is more expensive when we're running Ghash. So running AES alongside that may not cost anything noticeable. I don't know what the cost would be.
Let's take the discussion of the issue then.
Okay. I can at least volunteer to write up the things so people can see them in front of them in case anybody's confused.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, if we are strictly speaking about the norms and not recomputing the key, then my number says that you can do that at something like 20 gig per second on a CPU.
Okay, so I keep on saying let's move on, and yet the mic line still keeps on filling.
Sorry, process question as owner of the issue and writer of the PR. My opinion is on this is irrelevant. What I'm getting from the room is that some people assume that one is better because they think something is cheap. Some people assume that the other is better because they think something is expensive. No one's willing to like lay down on the road and kicking and screaming on this. If we take it to the list, people will keep giving more arguments and more opinions, and it will go on and on. I think I would really prefer for this to be a coin toss here and now, so then we can merge this PR and I can move on with my life. If someone actually runs those numbers and has further input down the line to the working group, that can warrant things, and that can warrant changes to just about anything in the protocol. But for now, in our current knowledge, in our current state, let's do a coin flip so we can move on.
So here's the thing about coin flips. We did 4 in HTTP2, and if I remember correctly, 2 of them didn't turn out so well in the long run.
Those are pretty regular odds for coin flips.
Them's the odds.
Yeah. But so what I'm saying is the only thing that could make us make a informed decision is some new data, and we can reopen this if and when some people come up with new data. But I have a very strong intuition that people will come up with opinions, not data.
So David, let me ask you this. As the author of the PR, have you heard anything in the room today that will make you change that PR?
Not yet, but if the coin falls on that side, I can change the PR.
Okay. The editors, do you still believe that this is proposal ready? You just want to flip a coin.
We haven't flipped a coin yet for Quic.
If you look at the list on the PR, there's a bunch of approvals. At the same time, there's been a discussion that just happened here. And this is exactly coin flip territory. I don't think that you're going to find a resolution there. Yes, it is proposal ready based on what we had earlier, and now this is there's more discussion now that's causing people to maybe think that we could do something slightly different, but it was proposal ready. We can always open it again later, as David says, if we have data, but at this point we are speculating. So I'm saying that we should either merge it as it is or do a coin flip, but either ways we should finish it.
I'm sorry, I didn't get that.
I'm sorry, I'm saying that we should merge it as it is or do a coin flip and decide which way we are going.
If Mark isn't going to stop me, I'll come here. Roberto Peon.
You just need. I'm sorry, the speakers aren't as loud up here, so I can't hear a lot of what you're saying.
We did a hum for what people like. We can also discriminate a little more by doing a hum for what people don't like. If you care, I'm perfectly fine with a coin flip myself.
Well, the question that I want to ask is that this is a proposal ready. We can do a call for consensus on this in the next batch. This is already.
So this had a call for consensus.
Oh, sorry, this was issued.
And Ecker raised a point on that, saying what he said in the room
this
here.
This is the one that he did that on. Yeah. So Ecker, has any of this changed your mind? All right.
Mike Bishop, if I can offer a suggestion. As a previous comment noted, the distinction between these two, one clearly offers a little bit of benefit, and there's question about what the cost is. Would anyone volunteer to get the data on the cost and see if there actually is a difference? Okay. So if we accept Christian's data that this can be done at what, 20 gigs a second? That seems.
The data is very simple. I mean, if we do regular AES encryption on packets, we have a different nonce for every packet. And on the measurement, we run that at 20 gigs on a CPU in the Windows stack. So that's.
I think we should move on. Praveen, one more.
Yeah, one last comment. Like this is like a DOS attack scenario, right? So we are talking about system already under stress. So any solution that puts even more burden on the system to generate the retry is, I think, like not ideal.
Okay. Let's take it back to discussion. I don't think we're going to make any more progress right now. Thank you. Yeah, our scribe is reminding us to say our names when we're speaking. So let's move on to the other documents. Let's start with recovery, I think. So recovery editors, we have 6 open issues. Are there any that you need to get some input from the working group on? Anyone want to discuss?
Yes, definitely the second one. And possibly the third. I think those are the 2 I want. I have a highlight at the end that I think is the question at least I want guidance on. This actually mostly comes down to pseudocode. Yeah, for the working group. The proposed PR attempts to include a mechanism to limit C-wind increase during slow start when not pacing. By itself, this does not actually fully guarantee the must that we have in another normative section. My opinion is I would rather not add pseudocode for cases that we don't recommend. We say you should pace packets if possible, and you may not, and if you do not, then you need to limit bursts. But if people would like pseudocode for mays as well as shoulds, then we need to kind of revisit that and expand the pseudocode quite substantially. So this is not actually a normative issue, but I'd like some guidelines on like what is the expectation of the pseudocode? Does it need to like cover all the things you may do? For example, there's no text or no pseudocode right now around detecting packet reordering and increasing the packet reordering threshold as a result of reordering. And that's another one that I can see adding, but it's fairly complex. And so it's a fair bit of work. Yeah, sorry, Ian Sweat, Google. I should have said that at the beginning.
Thank you.
But I'd like some guidelines here is really what I'm asking for. Right. Not only about this PR, but about going forward.
And I think we'll hear from Vidi next. Go ahead. We lost her. Actually, did we lose Mideko? No. Okay. We'll wait to hear back. So, fantastic. No. Mideko, we seem to be having some troubles. Go ahead, John. All right, let's try one more time. No, that's not good. Go ahead, Jana.
Jana Iyengar. So I'll make just a couple of notes. The pseudocode lives in the appendix. That's by design. The reason it's in the appendix is because it doesn't have any normative status. The text is normative. The pseudocode is merely a guidance to implementers about how to implement the text that's already in the draft. And to the extent that we want to add stuff or not add stuff there, that's really up to us. It's all guidance in there anyways. So if there is an implementer who's asking for how to do this, which happens to be the case, I don't see any reason to not add it. At the same time, I don't have a strong opinion on this. I personally am of the opinion that we should be pacing, but that's my personal opinion, not the working groups.
Okay. Vidya, I'm going to try one more time, and if this time doesn't work, why don't you give your input through Jabber, and we'll Jabber relay it to the room. No. Try Jabber, please, Vidya. Sorry about that. Go ahead, Eric.
Eric Kinnear. So I think it does say that we should be pacing, and so it feels as though we should have a copy of the pseudocode, which is kind of the main, like, this is what you are expected to do. And to Jana's point, if there is an implementation or a group of implementations where we know that there's kind of another branch that can be taken in terms of what the implementation is doing, it seems fine to have a section in the pseudocode for here is kind of the alternative, but I would suggest that that be a separate section so that there is a clean copy of, but basically, there should be a clean copy of the pseudocode for if you are an implementer and you just read through the pseudocode and you do that thing, you're following the main recommendations of the draft. And where we have a place in the draft like this, where we've kind of said, if you aren't following the main recommendations, you must do this other stuff, it seems fine to have pseudocode for that, but it'd be nice to have a distinction.
Gori Fair has a good being at the back, because I would agree with what we just said. And in this case, we have 4960 with some pseudocode for another protocol to kind of build on anyway. So let's keep the main path really clean on the shoulds. And if you want to do the must other, then that's fine. But there is already a reference to how to do it on this one.
Andrew McGregor, I kind of agree with what people are saying about the pseudocode, but we should keep this documentation because it's entirely possible that an implementation may have pacing support that isn't always functional, and it needs to know what to do, and we need to know what to do when it's not working.
Roberto Payon, Google. This seems editorial. Sorry. Yeah. Old habits die hard. No longer Google. Thank you very much.
Daniel Khan Gilmore, relaying for Vidigo. As Jana said, the pseudocode is a reference for implementations which don't implement pacing. This would provide completeness to the pseudocode for increasing congestion windows.
Okay, so editors, does that give you the input that you need? It sounds like there's general support for having something here.
I think we can figure this out. This is, again, like I said, it doesn't have normative effect. So I don't see any reason why the working group really needs to spend a lot of time on this, but it was valuable to hear input about what people think the pseudocode should reflect.
Right. It's clear to me that the working group is split in not so different a way as Jana and I. So yeah, I think this is useful. Like, we can keep going.
Okay.
Praveen did want to note that there were a few issues that didn't get a design tag yet, because we are in this limbo where I'm not really sure. We're in the late stage process, and I haven't tagged things as design. So you might want to go through and see if there are things that aren't tagged with either editorial or design that also might deserve discussion. And if anyone knows where my badge is, then that'd be cool. Thanks. My name's Ian Sweat.
Maybe you could filter on not editorial instead of
Any others you want to discuss, editors? Or anyone else? Just for context, I think we have about, let's call it 20 minutes before we need to start the other discussions.
Yeah.
So for this and for HTTP.
A couple of issues here. You can see those ones right there, which make RFC 6928 normative. And can we make a normative reference to 8085? This is worth noting because we are changing something, or there's a proposal to change something here that we had agreed upon earlier to not do. We had agreed earlier in this working group that we wouldn't have normative references to TCP RFCs for the mechanisms that we use here. However, Gauri has noted that in his review that we don't have any strong basis outside of these references for some constants that we use. For example, we use the 6928 value of initial window of 10. The basis for that is RFC 6928, which is a TCP RFC. Similarly, we use a reordering threshold of 3. That is, again, I can't remember which one that is. So that's one issue. That's the first one, 3245. So there's a suggestion and a proposal and a PR there now to make that RFC normative. It seems completely reasonable. The argument is that 6928, even though it was written for TCP, the only discussion there is about the size of the initial window. And to the extent that the size of the initial window matters, it doesn't matter what the protocol uses, it's about network load. So we should be able to use that RFC directly and use that as the basis for making our decision. I want to talk about 8085 as well, but I'll let we'll finish 6928 first.
So, I guess the question is, does that cause anyone heartburn?
Yeah, I'm motivated making that normative. It is AXP status, but I think it's a useful document to be normative for this one.
So there's actually, so that raises an interesting issue, which we may have to deal with later on, which is that this is a standards track document, and 6928 is, well, it's a standards track document, but it's experimental. So we'll be putting a dependency on that. Maybe that's all right. I'm happy to figure it out later on.
If folks have concerns about that, get to the mic line.
Martin Duke. I don't understand. What's the difference between having a normative reference to 6928 or just saying the initial window must or should or whatever be 3 in the Quic document, just saying the reason why is over here if you care?
Well, okay, that's interesting, but then is Quic experimental status? And how are we going to justify this choice? I mean, someone's already done this, made this choice. If you make it normative, then that choice is okay. Informative.
Use the microphone, please.
Yeah, okay, well, you can open this.
Yeah, that seems like a great solution, Martin. I mean, I thought I was. That seems like a great solution. The purpose of the text is to explain what the heck you're doing, and like pointing to the document explains it, but it's not a normative reference. It's just like citing a paper. You say we set it to this value, and go read this paper to find out why.
So Corey, is it your contention that we should not have the normative? So I mean, like how the documents are arranged, I think is secondary. Like the question is, should we have a normative reference on what the initial window is, or not?
I think we should, and I think that's what I would advocate here. If the AD finally decides that it's a downref that they don't want to put up with, then they can take it back. But I think we should have it as a normative reference because it is the basis on which this decision is being made.
But I don't think that's most people's understanding of what
normative
normative is.
go with it. We take the pacing requirement that goes with it. And if that pacing requirement's removed, then this document could be changed. Or you're saying you're just going to independently do the experiment. You declare that as an experiment we're going to do here. I mean, let people talk.
So what normative requirement means is you have to understand, in order to understand the specification you're reading, you have to read the other thing. But I'm not going to agree with you right now because I understand the specification perfectly well. It's got a number in it. The number's there. An informational reference means that you may want to read this in order to understand like background or other information, but I don't like the number is sufficient to put the specification. And so like if you look at like any random like crypto like using thing, it's like full of like references to like papers and IEEE S&P and Unix security and those things. And those are all and it's very hard to understand that the technical choices we've made in these protocols that are reading those papers, but you don't need to, and that's why those are informative references. And so to the extent to which the reason for the reference is this is the background for why this number is chosen, that is an informative reference.
Okay, I see lots of nodding heads, so let's keep it brief. I don't want to spend too much time on this. Corey, one last word.
Yeah, we shouldn't discuss this at the mic now. We should figure out what we want to do.
Let's take this offline, I think, but we've heard from a bunch of people. Editors, any others on recovery?
So there's a similar, slightly different, but question on 8085. So 8085 is the UDP guidelines RFC. I can't remember the exact title, but it's basically about UDP-based protocols, and they're specifically targeting the congestion control behavior. The question here was, should we have a normative reference to that RFC in our recovery draft? Given that we talk about congestion control, but we also do allow, well, that's the issue that was raised. So yeah, so there's a PR that fixes this, but it also has changes 8085 to normative. Now, this is not a TCP RFC, so this doesn't go against anything we've agreed on in the past. I think this is reasonable.
I agree. I also think this is reasonable. Although if our position is that we just don't want normative references in this doc, then obviously we shouldn't do this. But I think this is a much more reasonable choice
Much
than
more
the
straightforward.
other RFC.
Yeah. Any comment on that?
Yeah. So Madam Thompson, I think the PR is fine. This issue was badly worded. We don't take normative references unless we have a reason to take a normative reference. The bug that we had in here was that we had a specification that defined a congestion control algorithm that did not, that was optional, effectively, but we did not have a requirement to say that if you do Quic, you need to have some form of congestion control mechanism. And that is what 8085 provides for us, and that is what we're depending on it for, and this PR fixes that problem.
Anything else, editors?
If people have time, not right now, if they care about the handshake deadlock prevention stuff, I would request that they take a look at 3161 in the attached PR and give me feedback as to whether I should just close it with no action or not. But we don't need to discuss it now. But I asked for a review just because I think only 3 people or 2 people have looked at it. And then the other issue is, I think Praveen had 1 or 2 issues that, is there anything critically you want to discuss, Praveen?
Yeah, Praveen, I just opened a few recently, so I would request the editors to review them and the other folks as well. There's at least seems to be 1 safety issue that I found in the app limited case, and there is 2 deviations from TCP calculations for certain timers. So we should reconcile those.
Okay. So same question for HTTP. What issues do we want to discuss?
So probably the most thorny one we already discussed. We've got a couple that are assigned, some with outstanding PRs. So I think the main one that I would like to see working group feedback on today is 3265. So this one is notable in that it's requesting something that is kind of new to HTTP and kind of not. So basically, in H1, you have headers before the body, you have trailers after the body, and if you're doing chunked, you have chunk extensions, kind of, sort of, which are their own thing. In H2, we don't have chunk extensions, but you can send headers, you can send trailers. This is a request that we remove the restriction that there only be trailers after the body and say that you can send trailers at any point after the body has started, and they're all just trailers. They can arrive anytime. That's a little bit of a change. I don't think it's breaking anything. I don't think it's required by our charter. So I'd just like to get feedback about whether we want that or not.
Kazuho.
Kazuho, I think this proposal by itself is a sensible thing, though I wonder if the Quic working group is expected to make the decision. So I think it might actually be a good idea to raise this topic as an HTTP working group issue and then discuss this as an extension to HTTP 2 and HTTP 3.
So with various chair hats on, I think we do need to go and at least highlight this in the HTTP working group and make sure that there's comfort there. There are folks like Julian who aren't following this as closely over there. I have a personal response, but I'll let the queue drain. Go ahead, Patrick.
Sure. Pat McManus. On its face, this is perfectly reasonable. This was perfectly reasonable also in H1, and as I recall, we didn't add a hook for it into H2 because it was never used. And given that no one's clamoring for it this time, I really think
Can you speak up just a tiny bit?
And given that there's no strong use case presented here, I think we ought to really let that decision ride.
So Martin Thompson, we more or less signed on for the contract of porting the H2 semantics across, which we're very clear about where trailers can appear. This is kind of a cool idea, though. But I think that the request here needs to come from the HTTP working group.
Lucas Pardew. Just reading this description, I wasn't sure if Roy's request put in scope any idea of this kind of behavior for server push, or the pushed response, push request from server to client. So I think that is something to keep in mind, and I might do that.
Sorry, how would that affect push?
Is the feature request here applicable to pushed requests? i.e., is there any capability to add trailers to pushed requests? So if the answer is no, then that's a constraint of this, which is already there, but should be kept in mind.
Okay.
This is Roy Fielding to answer that Lucas's question. I'm not aware of any tied to push, I would say, responses. I don't think it's requests.
Bit closer to the mic, please.
I don't think there's any, at least I'm not aware of any connection to push responses that would require a trailer. But then I don't have all that much experience using push responses that last for more than a single frame. In this, I wanted to come up to the mic to point out that when we discussed HTTP2, a lot of emphasis was made is that we do all these things in the next version of HTTP2. As soon as this working group started, folks said, well, we're not going to do another working group HTTP2. So guess what? Quic is HTTP2 version 2. And if we do not act responsibly when we have needs within the protocol, just because of the chartering discussion, the charter must change because it's taking over a protocol that's very important to the internet, and we can't have continuing 7-year blocks of time that cannot adjust the basic protocol because the working group that's working on the next version doesn't want to address changes that might have come up for the previous version. I just don't understand.
So if you have
this
a proposal for a charter change,
Well, I
We
mean,
can- you
my
can bring
my,
that to the
my
chairs.
my suggestion is that this is within the scope of the charter because it refers to HTTP semantics.
I don't think anyone's disputing it on charter scope right now. So keep your powder dry. I'm going to cut the queue, but go ahead.
David Skenazy, Google Chrome. If there was a use for this, someone would have built it as an extension to HTTP2. Often, like when there is a use case for something, people build it. So that I get that that's not entirely true because sometimes the people who build it are not the same people who write the stacks. But very often you'll hear them clamoring that they want a new feature. And especially when a feature can be trivially implemented as an extension, there would have been some movement there. I would much rather see this as an extension. And if, like we've been doing with like TLS 1.3 and HTTP3, popular extensions get ported into the next version of the protocol. This is not a popular extension of H2 that warrants putting into H3. So I would, and on top of that, this would require some work, which I'd rather not have to do. So I'd strongly encourage this to become an extension. And if it gets widely used, then we can add it to the next revision.
Victor, the queue's cut.
Martin Duke. I have no technical opinion this at all, but I think if we are going to kind of mess with HTTP2 in ways that are not immediately germane to Quic, I think we should have the HTTP working group give us guidance, and as long as it doesn't influence the schedule, we can try to bring it in, and that's kind of at Mike's prerogative. And I'd rather not waste more time discussing the technical merits of that in this forum with people who don't know what people like me who don't know what they're talking about. Thanks.
Sure. So I think we're hearing, that the impetus for this has to come from the HTTP working group. And I think from a charter standpoint, we're chartered, I think, to allow the semantics of HTTP2. That's been a problematic phrase in the charter for a while because really the semantics of HTTP2 are driven by the generic semantics of HTTP. And so this is probably an HTTP core issue. If those semantics are, clarified in HTTP core, we can choose to bubble those into HTTP3. And that would be the path I think that would be most sensible for this. I think personally I agree with Martin. This is pretty cool. I think a lot of people can imagine use cases for this if it were commonly available. What I like about it is that it's backwards compatible with existing APIs. There's one thing about the wire serialization and decoding the frames and everything, but there's another thing about how do I bubble this up to applications? And if my API doesn't support having trailers in the middle, I can just collect them and then make them available at the end if the trailer supports normal trailers. The API supports normal trailers. So I think it's deployable. But let's have the discussion in the HTTP working group. Roy, maybe perhaps you could open an issue on core and we can discuss it even tomorrow and then see where that goes. Make sense? Okay. Sorry, an issue in... Yes, an issue in core, please. HTTP core. Thank you. I assume that's what you mean by the other group. We're not going to pull a third group into this, are we? Okay, good. Mike, any other HTTP issues you want to discuss now?
I think most of the others have pending resolutions or at least assignments. So if you have an issue assigned to you, please make progress on that PR. I would appreciate it. And otherwise, I think we might be better served by getting to the other presentations.
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
We might be better served by the other presentations.
Okay, fantastic. So one more thing before we go to those. We have an open call for consensus on taking the recovery and HTTP documents to the late stage process. From talking to folks, I think we're pretty much ready to do that. We'll leave that open a little bit longer for any other further feedback on the mailing list, and then we'll make the transition for those. Okay. So what ordering did we decide upon? We decided upon datagrams first. Sorry? It's not going to do you any good. Sorry. Yeah. One moment. I'm not going to put random USB things in my laptop. Nice try. Go ahead, Eric.
All right. We're going to try to keep this decently short because it's fairly straightforward and we've got a lot of other good stuff to do. So I'm going to try to get through all the slides and then we'll talk a little bit at the end of that. So we've talked about this before and we've had some side meetings and other things in which many of you have engaged. So thank you for that. But I'm Eric Kinnear in the middle of this slide and let's talk datagrams. So in some of the side meetings and the other conversations that we've been having, we've learned a very long list of use cases where people think that they would like to use datagrams to support unreliable data transmission. And I put a couple on this slide, but there's really way more. And really the thing that seems to shine and come out from all these are applications that would like to have a reliable control stream or some sort of negotiation and reliable transmission of information between the two endpoints to coordinate some other transmission which can then be unreliable. We also notice here that Quic provides functionality beyond what you just get over DTLS and UDP. A lot of that being the multiplexing of these streams. And the last reason we really wanted to do this was because it's a very straightforward extension that makes sure that we can kind of grease and use the extension mechanism and make sure that it's working. Next slide, please. So we want datagrams in Quic as opposed to just DTLS or somewhere else because we want to be able to share that same handshake and authentication context that you're using for your reliable stream data and your existing communication with some other endpoint for unreliable data as well. Along with using that handshake, et cetera, comes with the fact that Quic generally is going to work pretty well for that. For example, DTLS retransmits handshake packets on a fixed timer, and Quic is going to be using the full mechanisms of Quic to get packets to the other side. And there's also a bunch of other Quic features that are really nice. So things like transport parameters and the ability to negotiate things up front. Having acknowledgments of this datagram data, so even if it's not retransmitted, you can tell whether or not it got there and potentially adjust your sending rate or make other choices based on that information. And you can also multiplex additional content over the same transport. So you have the ability to sit there and have your control stream, have some other content going, and bring up multiple different streams worth of data, one of which is this unreliable datagram. Next, please. The design has simplified greatly since we first started talking about it, so thank you all for your feedback. There's now 2 frame identifiers, and it's really just the last bit there determines whether or not there's a length field present. So if there's a length field present, you have a datagram frame followed by the length of that datagram frame, and then whatever data you want. And if it's not present, then it extends to the end of the packet, so you can skip that extra overhead for those of us who are super concerned about overhead, which starts to actually matter when you start talking about tunneling and doing some other things. It's negotiated via the max datagram frame size transport parameter, which helps a lot when you're looking at things like PLPMTUD. Next slide, please. So in terms of the details that we've hammered out since we started talking about this, datagram frames are ACK eliciting. They are not retransmitted. Ping is the same way, but in at least our implementation, we discovered we'd made some interesting assumptions about what ACK eliciting meant in terms of recovery and congestion control. So we need to make sure that we have the distinction between frames that are not retransmitted and frames that are, separately from frames that are ACKed versus not. They also do not contribute to flow control limits. However, they are congestion controlled. So you've got your congestion control getting your pipe of data to the other side of your connection, but there is no sane way to do flow control here, so we took that out. Flow IDs are also gone. Thank you for your lovely feedback. However, they didn't go super far. David has written up a draft that adds flow IDs into the HTTP3 datagrams, which can live on top of this. So it's pretty much exactly the same, but it solves a lot of the flow ID questions. So please take a look at that document and go there. And the other thing that's noted in here is that max datagram frame size can be stored and used in 0RTT requests, et cetera, et cetera. Next slide, please. We were really, really happy to see that at the hackathon, we actually got some interop on here, and there are several more implementations, even since I wrote this slide, that I know have been looking at adding datagram support because it should be pretty quick. but we've got several that are already doing it. And also, thank you folks for the Wireshark dissector. The screenshot of that's pretty fun. You have a little datagram thing, and then there's a blob that currently says Quic. So yeah, so so far the feedback from implementers has been that it's not super difficult to add support for this frame type. There have been some really good discussions around API and how you let an application know that something was probably lost or certainly act. So those are good things to keep in mind, but don't actually affect the on-the-wire bits at all. Next slide, please. So that brings us to the end of our hopefully short set of slides. So thoughts, feelings, and the other thing we were looking for this time was to potentially talk about a call for adoption.
Sure. So just to be clear, you're suggesting a call for adoption just for the Quic datagram document, not the HTTP3 binding.
Correct.
Right. There's an interesting question there that when we do get to the HTTP binding, whether that's done here or in the HTTP working group, because our intention has been to hand off H3 to them after we're done.
Exactly.
Yeah. Mike.
Mike Bishop, this is not a question directly on datagrams, but something that datagrams brings up. I noticed that you reserved 2 adjacent frame types so that you could embed a flag in the type just like the InSpec frames do. Do our new reservation policies that require random assignment allow for that?
Good question.
I think
we just changed the registration policies for, well, okay. We discussed in Cupertino and we have a PR, and part of the guidance in that is that IANA is that we randomly allocate, isn't it? Are you allowed to randomly allocate to adjacent points under the current text, or
a block of registrations
add
effectively?
some language around that?
Yeah. As someone who's worked with Martin on that PR, it doesn't quite say that, so we should just add text to allow it because that makes a whole lot of sense.
Okay. Victor, I think was next. So.
Victor Vasiliev, Google. We use Datagram Frame currently in production, so I fully support working group taking on this work.
Roberto Peon, Facebook. I'm certain that we're going to adopt this pretty much, and that's a little scary for me because I worry about the fact that it's going to be interesting at proxies, especially without flow control. So I think there's a lot of hidden problems here that we've suffered through in the past. Again, I'm sure we're going to adopt this, and I bet people are going to figure this out, which I guess is a good thing because then we can replace it with something better. But it might be a good idea to at least put some text in about the fact that intermediaries with no flow control is a recipe for fun.
So folks in the queue, one thing that I'd like to hear about is timing in terms of whether you think it's important to adopt this now or whether it's important to wait, if you think we should adopt it.
Yeah, Chris Wood, I think we should adopt it. It's good work. I have no opinion on timing. I guess that's for other people who care more about this. I just want to say that there are interesting security implications that come from this particular extension. As a watered down example of something that might go wrong, imagine an application is using a datagram frame to send a very secret, specific, sensitive message like fire the missile. And you have an attacker who's like randomly dropping packets and waiting to see whether or not things are retransmitted. The fact that these are not retransmitted leaks a bit of information. And like how that affects, Quic security posture is sort of not clear. I've been talking with Kenny Patterson about this particular issue. Don't know if it's a big deal, but like something to keep in mind and maybe worth an acknowledgement at some point in the draft. But yeah. No, by the fact that it's retransmitted, but.
Can I quickly jump in as a author of the document? Chris, would you be willing to file an issue discussing this problem against our GitHub, please?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. I'm going to close the queue very soon, I think.
Mozinati, I think this is important work to do now, especially because I think it's going to surface things that need to be fixed in other drafts, especially recovery. Presumably, a big user of this will be media applications, and the flow control and congestion control sections of recovery and even this draft they need a lot of work. There are a lot of conflicting and contradictory things, and it needs to go broader than just this group. There's other groups and other areas that need to weigh in on this too. So I think it needs to be done now sooner than later.
Martin Duke, F5. Very exciting and I think very important work. My only concern is bandwidth. I think there are a few. We're starting to punt things into extensions that we really, really need soon after V1 ships to make Quic work properly, like version greasing, like maybe this version negotiation thing, etc. And I think we can probably walk and chew gum at the same time, but I would like to. I think there's a lot of key resources that need to commit to support to work through all these things simultaneously.
Hi, Colin Perkins. I think as a minimal datagram extension, this is a very reasonable thing, and I think we should adopt it. Before we finalize it, I would be interested to see how people are using datagrams and what people are building on top of it. We may find that a slightly less minimal datagram extension turns out to be a more appropriate design once we have a little more experience. Flow IDs being the obvious thing in that space.
Thank you. The queue's closed after Jana.
And yes, you can clearly build one on top of the other. If everyone is using a flow ID, if it turns out that everyone using datagrams wants a flow ID, we should probably just build this into the datagram.
Lucas Pardew, I support adoption of this document. I think that although the design of the frame itself is fairly simple, there's many issues in terms of how we use this thing, and that having a venue to bring in people to discuss those and actually capture that information is really important.
Yeah, I think we should adopt this now. I don't think there's any reason to wait, and I appreciate all the simplifications that have gone into it, because that makes it much clearer to reason about and gives me a lot more confidence that we're not going to screw this up.
And who are you? Sorry.
That was Ian.
Thank you.
I am Brian. We are both from Google, although entirely different parts of the company. Yeah, actually, I basically came up to say what Mo said, and then what Ian said, and then what Lucas said. So, do it now.
Jana Iyengar, I support adoption of this document, but it is a bit of a foot gun, like Roberto says. But I think it's an obvious foot gun. We all knew this was coming. That said, I will say just one point, which is that I think this is useful in another way. People are already implementing it, so we actually get to exercise the extension mechanism, and I think that's super useful. That we don't need to prioritize this because the functions here aren't critical. I think Martin Duke was right that we have other things, but this one is useful because it actually allows us to implement and exercise that.
Okay, I think that's all good input. Thank you very much, Eric. I'll talk to Lars, we'll talk to our directors, and we'll likely see a call for adoption soon, but we do need to consider the charter aspect of this as discussed. Thank you. Next up, where were we? Oh. Version negotiation.
Good morning, everyone.
Oh, sure.
Thanks. My name is David Skenazy. I work at Google, and I'm here to talk about Quic version negotiation. So this draft is joint work by Eric Rascola and myself. Next slide, please. So first point, wait a minute, what are we talking about? Doesn't Quic already have version negotiation? Yes, to some extent. The Quic invariants define a version negotiation packet. It uses version 0 and it sends a bunch of versions. In Quic v1, so the Quic transport draft, it says if you receive one of those, just fail the connection. Report back up to the application that Quic is broken. We cannot use Quic because the server doesn't support this version. That's fine when the only version in the world is version 1. Because if the server doesn't support it, then you're dead in the water. But what if another version were to come about? The client could, in theory, just get that packet and reconnect with that version if it supports it too. The problem, if you just do that naively, you could expose yourself to a downgrade attack. What if an attacker sent that packet and because the client supports version 1 and 2, and it turns out that 1 is no longer safe because we found a really bad bug in it. We don't want an attacker to force you to use 1, even though both the client and server support 2. So that's the main thing. Another point is the main premise of Quic's existence in the first place is to be fast, to allow us to actually send the request to the server in as few round trips as possible. So spending a round trip is a deal breaker, especially for browsers. So if we were, for example, to say, we have Quic v1 and then Quic v2 comes around, some of the servers will support 1 and some of them will support 1 and 2. The browser can't just go to 2. And then in the case where some servers don't support it, spend a round trip to then go to 1. That's too expensive and that's a complete deal breaker. So what do we do? Next slide, please. So if going back a year, I don't know, we've been doing this for too long. I don't remember when we did what. At some point, we had this as part of the spec. The original transport parameters code had support for downgrade prevention. And the way it worked is the server would just send all its versions, and the client would say, wait a minute, I originally sent you this version, and now you're telling me that we switched to something else, but you supported the first one in the first place? What the hell? That must be an attack. Abort. But someone at the time, I've forgotten who, pointed out that if you have multiple servers, as in you talk to a first one and it tells you, no, I don't support this version negotiation, you try again and you land on a different server because you got load balanced, and they don't have the exact same set of versions, then you can end up in a situation where for the client, it looks like a downgrade attack, when in reality, you just hit 2 different servers that are both equally trusted and both have the private keys for the TLS cert. So that's bad, both in the multi-CDN case, but also if you're just in your own network, incrementally deploying your software, and so there'll be a period of time where the new version is hit here, but not there. So at the time, we were starting to argue about how to fix this, and as with all the problems that are, or a lot of the problems that aren't blocking for Quic v1, we said, okay, punt this out. We don't need it. We want to focus on getting Quic v1 in. We can always build this as an extension later. This is that extension. It comes with 2 main goals: solving the downgrade prevention problem, but also this spending an RTT problem. It allows us to deploy Quic v2 on the internet in a way that both the client and server use it without the deal-breaking spend of an RTT. Next slide, please. So in order to do that, this draft introduces a concept which is compatible versions. The idea there being that if Quic v2 ends up looking very much like Quic v1, let's say, for example, that Quic v2 is Quic v1 plus the datagram frame. That wouldn't change much for HTTP 3, so you could say these versions are very similar. Would be great if we didn't spend the RTT. So we define compatible versions as when the server receives the client first flight. So in Quic v1, that's the initial containing the client hello. If it can understand that and map that to a v2 or version B, as I put it here, first flight, then they're compatible. So the mechanism is the client sends the first flight of the version it thinks that is most likely to be supported. So for example, if v2 just came out, that would be v1. And the server and the client says, oh, by the way, I also support v2, which I know is compatible with v1. And then the server says, oh, I support that too. Let me convert your initial to whatever first flight is in v2 and run with that. So then the initial that the server responds with is now a v2 initial. Pretty simple. We just need to make sure that we don't allow downgrade attacks or foot guns. Next slide, please. So how do we do this? And as with most extensions, it's a transport parameter. So the transport parameter contains different things on client and server. On the client, Ted, do you want me to go through the slides, or is it for now?
I have a question at the end.
Okay. So the transport parameter on the client contains a few things. The first one is the currently attempted version. So that's redundant from the version that is in the long headers of that initial. But what it means is that version lands in the TLS key schedule. And if we've learned anything from the history of TLS, is that if things are not in the key schedule, then you can end up with some really funky attacks where someone swaps it and you don't realize it. So we put that in there. That way it prevents an attack where your attacker is just swapping over that version. You also add your previously attempted version, meaning if I tried A, got a version negotiation, and tried B, when I'm trying B, I'll say here that, oh, I tried A originally, by the way. And I send a copy of this version negotiation packet I got from the server. And just a payload, which is just a list of versions that were in the version negotiation packet. So the idea there is on the server, when you get that, you can check if in response to this previously attempted version, you could have potentially sent this VN packet. And the client sends one last thing, which is the list of compatible versions that the server could in-band switch to if it supported them. Next slide, please. From the server's perspective, the first thing is the negotiated version. So similar, that's also the version that's going to be on the long headers, but that way we landed in the key schedule. And then the supported versions list. So the idea there is if there are incompatible version in particular, especially, let's say version 3 is not compatible, you can tell the client, hey, by the way, for next time, I support this. So the client can cache that if it wants. The same way today we cache things based on alt service, for example. Next slide. So how does this work for downgrade? If the attacker is tampering with the version in the long headers, though the first part in the transport parameter won't match, so the TLS key schedule will fall over. And the way Quic is defined, you have a bunch of versions and a bunch of long headers, but the first one you get is what you establish on that connection. So if it changes after that, you drop them on the floor. So you have that strong mapping here. And then if an attacker forges a version negotiation packet, so
clarification.
Yes.
Client and server have to check these things match in order for things to fall over. It's not just the handshake falls over automatically.
True. Sorry, that is what I meant. Like both sides upon receiving stuff need to make sure that they match. Agreed. So if an attacker forges this or create one, the list of things, like because those are there, it can say, wait, the server can say, wait a minute, I would have never sent you this VN packet because I know all my servers support this version. That's bad. And if the server deployment has different banks where it knows, like over here I support 1 and 2, and over here I only support 1, then it can say, yeah, it's possible that I sent you a version negotiation for just 1 because I know I own some servers that do that. And also if you're in the multi-CDN use case, if you know what the other CDN versions, you can do that here. Next slide.
Quick question on Mike Bishop. If somebody tampered with the version, isn't that part of the AAD? The packet would just fail to parse?
Yeah, but on initial packets,
that's right. Initial packets can be rewritten.
All right, so the mechanism is pretty simple. The draft tries to describe that. The draft originally only did compatible versions, and kind of a few weeks ago before the deadline, we kind of rushed in to add the downgrade prevention, and so it makes the draft really clunky to read, so that's on me. I think we need to work a lot on the framing and refactor it to make it a lot more sensical, but I think the mechanism is correct. So what do folks think? Especially there are cases like the ossification work that Kazuho proposed that might require version negotiation. So I think it would be nice to have this in the working group and to progress it.
Okay, I can see a lot of people want to talk about this. We have about 5 minutes. So I would suggest that we focus on, is this an area that the working group thinks it needs an extension in? Is this a reasonable starting point for that extension, knowing that it can change? And do we need to do it now or do we need to wait? And questions of clarification if you need them to answer the previous questions. Please go, Ted.
Ted Hardy. My clarification question actually relates to the discussion we had yesterday with ALPN.
We can't hear you, Ted.
Okay. I wanted to ask the relationship between this and the discussion we had yesterday about potentially using ALPN with full stack as opposed to just the particular application layer. If we do ALPN with full stack, does that obviate the use of this? Okay, thank you.
So basically this version negotiation mechanism is for the transport layer, and if you don't speak this, you don't understand the client version at the transport layer, you won't be able to parse the ALPN. So there's still a need for this.
Roberto Peon. I did not see a clear discussion of what happens in the zero RTT case with this, and zero RTT being the thing that is now fun and providing a lot of value. I think that would be great. To answer Mark's things, the first answer is yes.
And to give a 10-second answer, ZRTT is a per version specific concept. So if you don't understand that version there, but that is a good point. We need to add more text. If you do for compatible versions, there's going to be work to figure that out.
If we do not figure that out, it will be difficult to upgrade because you will suffer performance penalties that you wouldn't otherwise.
Good point.
Kazuho, thank you for presenting the draft. I think this is important work. On the other hand, I wonder if there's an immediate need for this to be adopted due to two reasons. One is that, for example, something like datagrams can be negotiated using a feature. And my understanding is that we only need a version number change when the packets, the clear text part of packets that's being exchanged during the handshake changes. The second reason is that for something like version aliasing, we need a different kind of downgrade protection. For example, the proposal that we had using the new token frame was to use the value of the token to see if a downgrade should be prevented. So this one doesn't address the all cases where downgrade should be prevented. So that's one of the reasons I kind of wonder if we can park this until we have until we have a new Quic version that actually uses a different handshake mechanism.
I'm going to close the queue after Roy and Martin Duke batter up.
Martin Thompson, I think we need an answer to this one before we start working on version 2. I somewhat disagree with Kazuo, although I recognize the points are valid. This document needs a lot of editorial work. I provided that feedback. I think there's different ways to spell it, but the basic framework of what David described, which is to have the incompatible and compatible upgrades, is quite valuable. And so I think we should adopt it now and treat it like the other extensions. I don't think we need to block Quic V1 on this being complete, but I do think we need to be working on this so that we have a story for when we do have Quic V2. And we have a design. It's good enough. Take it.
Well, this mic's in the right place for once. Eric Piscola, I'm one of the authors. I think we should adopt this. I frankly have some misgivings about the incompatible negotiation, but we can fight that out in the working group. But I think like having that, like having a working group item to work on negotiation, I think like something we should do, and we can figure out the details later. I think this is a good technically good start.
Oh, Ian Sweat, Google. Yes, I also think we should adopt this though. If it turns out that, due to editorial work, it's easier to do so sometime between now and the next IETF in a few months, that's fine. But I think sometime in the next, 3 to 6 months, we should be doing this in this working group.
Roy Fielding, Adobe. I'd like to get a little bit back to the HTTP 1.1 or one versioning scheme that has the ability to send optimistically minor version changes that are compatible. So is there a way to do that in this scheme? And other than that, I would also approve adopting it.
So just a 10-second answer. So currently Quic at the transport layer doesn't have a concept of minor versions, but maybe the compatible versions is that. So we'd have to, maybe there's a mapping there. Let's take it offline. Or bring that to the list because I think that's an interesting point.
Okay. Thank you very much, David. We'll
where are we going from here?
I'll chat with Lars. We'll chat with the AR directors. It's definitely on the list.
Thanks.
Thank you. Go ahead, Martin.
Morning, everybody. I'm Martin Duke, one of the usual suspects. Just to see how much I need to talk about it. Can I see a show of hands who's read the draft? Okay, about half to 2/3. Good. Next slide. So this is about a lot of things, but it is mostly about allowing servers and load balancers owned or implemented by different entities to work together. Basically, you want load balancers to work off connection ID rather than 4 tuples so that you don't break NAT rebinding resilience and so on. And so ideally for a low state load balancer, the connection ID should contain the server ID mapping. And so this is just basically proposing several standardized methods of encoding the server ID mapping in the connection ID so that the load balancer can understand a packet and or understand the routing of a packet, get it to the correct server. Next slide. Okay, this has turned out to be a useful vehicle for several other problems. For instance, there's interest in having essentially the quick equivalent of cyclically offload, which I've decided to call retry services. So Nick Banks, I co-author, came up with a scheme on how to do that. So that's also in the draft. And then also there is interest in eventual hardware crypto offload for Quic. And after some conversation with Intel, I was certainly convinced that would very much benefit from somehow encoding the length of the CID inside the CID. And so if you are trying to use those services, this provides a standard way to do so. So we can use a fixed number of chips to solve that problem. Next slide, please. So basically, the underlying value, the value statement in Quic is that if middle boxes try to mess with the connection, it kills the connection. And this is amending that attitude to instead say that the server must explicitly consent to this sort of quote unquote contribution that the middle box is making. Next slide. This is fairly clear from the draft, but I do want to highlight this point. In a lot of conversations about security, it's very much a binary thing where something is secure or it is not. The point of a lot of these server ID encoding algorithms is to hide the fact that that 2 connection IDs that belong to the same connection are going to the same server. However, this mechanism has a limited ability to solve that problem. In this extreme, when you have one client connected to your server pool, you are linkable, no matter what the CIDs do. Next slide. Conversely, if you have approaching infinity clients per server, then you're about as unlinkable as you can be, regardless of how clumsy your scheme is. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, so the first part of this draft is basically just providing some common configuration and what to do given that configuration. That is, it's describing some algorithms. There are basically 3 bits to this. One is what method you're using to encode the original destination connection ID in a retry token to allow these retry services. A second thing is whether or not using the CID length encoding, and then the third thing is what algorithm you're using to encode the server ID in the connection ID. Next slide. And then there's more stuff there there's more parameters specific to each of those algorithms. Now, so again, the first part of this configuration. Then the second part is, well, how does the configuration get around? The draft definitely enables you to go ahead and use whatever existing config distribution infrastructure you have. That is probably encouraged. However, for people who don't have that, there is a very simple in-band protocol. It is the overriding design principles are 1, to be very simple, and 2, to look sort of like Quic, because the one thing you can guarantee about a path between the load balancer and the Quic server is that it admits Quic. Next slide. I've gotten robust and diverse feedback about that in-band configuration, and you can see some of it. I have no particular love for what I wrote down there, and if the working group as a whole kind of gave me a solid message to go with one of these 4 options, I would be happy to do so with 2 caveats. Number 1, find something needs to be use this, number 1. And number 2, I do want to talk a little bit about putting it in a different draft. So there is, of course, the general problem of proxy to server communication. In TCP, we have the proxy protocol. That does not work in Quic for a variety of reasons. There's some desire to maybe find a solution for Quic, and I would be happy to have this fall in with that effort, but that effort does not currently exist. Next slide. Some other discussion points. So one unfortunate property of all of this is that server infrastructures are deciding whether or not clients are linkable, when fundamentally that is something that affects the client most of all. And it would be great to have a way to communicate somehow with clients how linkable they would be if they attempted to migrate. And then clients could make the decision as to whether they wanted to go ahead and migrate or just tear down the connection and start over with a whole new connection should they change IP address. So you could do something with a transport parameter, particularly if something like QuickLB was a standard reference point on what was linkable, what was not. So I would appreciate feedback on that, and maybe there should be a quick extension. Second issue, retry services are they are of course version specific because retry packets are version specific. All the other stuff is based on connection ID. Connection ID is part of the invariance minus a link field, which probably will not have a problem. So do we really want to have things that are quick version specific and not version specific in the same draft? If we rev quick, that might just be an editorial pain. Without wading deep into the algorithms for people who weren't reading it, there are some of these methods involve encryption and some of them don't. There's one that is sort of an obfuscation algorithm that attempts to do some mathematical operations to make the server ID less obvious. A lot of people will say, I've heard from a lot of people that don't see that it's clear that that's cheaper than just doing crypto. On the other hand, I've heard some pushback from others that they would really like to see an option like this. And this actually kind of moves on to the second point, which is I think we've struggled a little bit to get really robust engagement with a lot of the low state load balancer vendors, particularly in the cloud environment. Nick, my co-author, has talked a little bit with the Azure people, and frankly, a lot of it is one obstacle is to get through the initial reaction of this sounds like a pain. Can you change quick so we don't have to do anything? Which is probably not a realistic view of things. So, really, it's what are people willing? This room is essentially the community of quick server implementers. So, obviously, your feedback is quite important. It would really be nice to. I'm still trying to work to try to get feedback from the other end of this communication to answer some of the questions, like the third one I have on this slide. Next, please. So I would like to move for adoption. There are a few fairly minor issues that are open on my private GitHub, but ultimately I don't think we can move forward on these larger questions without larger, broader working group input. And these algorithms are not that complicated. I've already played with implementing them. It was at most, 100 lines of code to do one of these algorithms. It would be really nice to start interoperating with them. I would hope to maybe do that as soon as Vancouver. And definitely there's an opportunity for somebody to help me set that up and define that.
Yeah.
And that's it. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Martin. So again, we only have a few minutes to discuss. I'd like people to focus on, is this appropriate for this working group? Is this the right time? Is this the right starting point? And especially I've heard a question of whether it's appropriate to do this in the Quic working group or elsewhere. So if you can speak to that, that'd be interesting. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So Martin Thompson, a few points. I like the model. I like the way you're framing this. I don't like the protocol, but we can talk about that. I'd probably like to see that separated. I don't want to see any ghetto crypto in any of the things we produce here. I would prefer that we have...
We're time limited. Let's move on.
So I'd like us to look pretty seriously at that sort of thing. One of the things this looks a lot like is the sort of work that happens in the ops area in this organization, and I predict that we'll have some Yang people looking at this one. I don't know how you want to manage that, but expressing these as Yang models is something that I suspect will happen whether you like it or not.
I'm open to using a Yang model to express the configuration. I actually cracked open the RFC for that and saw it was 172 pages, and then thought maybe I could get someone to do a Yang model for me. Yes,
I don't think it matters how it's spelled so much as what the contents of the model are. So let's concentrate on getting the models right, and then we can talk about how to spell it.
Okay, let's not go too deep. Keep the comments brief, please. Praveen.
I think the draft is great. Especially like the fact that we are giving options that are incrementally deployable instead of going to like a really expensive solution. It provides multiple solutions on the way there. And I think this extension of the 3 we talked about is the most important because it directly affects quick event deployment in like data centers in the cloud. So in terms of adoption, I think it's the most important. And we're already talking with like third-party load balancers about this. So I think it's very timely and very, very important.
Mia Kulevind, so I think Martin mostly said what I wanted to say. I think it's good that you put like the different parts apart, and like as much as I regret because these belong together, I think it's like easier to rip them apart. I'm especially uneasy about like defining a completely new protocol here for configuration. I think what could be in scope here is like the configuration itself, the Yang model, and the algorithms for sure, because we have an open issue on that one in the manageability draft, and I don't care if it's in that draft or if it's a separate draft, but I think it's very much in scope. And I just wanted to add that there is ongoing efforts about proxying in general, so that could fit, and we're moving on, and we probably will propose some more work at the next meeting. So that's in process, and we should sync up a little bit more.
Tommy Pauly, Apple. Yeah, so we should adopt it. We should adopt it now, and I agree that we should split out that other work.
The protocol work.
For the protocol work. Yeah, just leave the definition of the quick bits here. I think that's all we should do and kind of find maybe another home for that part.
Eric Kinnear, keeping things quick. What Tommy said, but I'd also like to say, yes, we should also adopt this because we, as people trying to deploy things at scale on the server side, it will be very helpful to have guidance in this area. And I think that's going to be instrumental in making a Quic that many people can deploy as opposed to a few people can deploy.
Igor Goshinsky, Verizon Media, Yahoo. Igor Goshinsky, Verizon Media, Yahoo, Edgecast. Right.
Very close to the microphone, please.
So I think this is great work. Thank you. Really fantastic to actually define every way of doing it. We absolutely should adopt this. This is one of those things that's missing from being able to actually go large scale deploy. I agree that the protocol actually probably should be split out because some of us will just want to express this as Yang. Some people want to express this as JSON. Other people want to do in-band. Different people want to do different things, but ultimately, I hate to use Doe as an example, but how we exchange the bits this day and age really doesn't matter for configuration. So just define a semantics and everybody else will figure out how to encode it. But the actual algorithms, that's what's more critical, and that requires interop, and that's awesome that you've done. So absolutely agree we should adopt this.
Thank you. One more remote.
Hi, this is Manasi Deval. I work at Intel, and I think this draft should be adopted.
Should be adopted? Okay, that's what I heard. Roberto, I think you'll have the last word.
What the last 4 people said.
Sorry?
What the last 4 people said.
Thank you. So I think from what I'm hearing, we should expect a revised draft from you that's pared down, perhaps? Does that make sense?
Yes, I would still, I mean, this slideshow is obviously available. There's a number of contentious issues. Well, contentious is not the right word. I've gotten no uniform feedback on a lot of these issues, so I'd encourage some of that, because I might even pare it down more.
Right.
But
and that's fine. We don't need the issues to all be solved to adopt that. We just need to have a good starting point and the right scope. And from what I heard, people have concerns about the protocol portion of it. So maybe we can pare that out, focus on the model, and then go from there.
Okay.
And do some coordination with ops, do some coordination elsewhere. We'll figure it out. Okay?
All right.
Great. Thank you.
you.
So one more thing. I think we've got 1 minute left. Jana, did you want to speak briefly? Thank you, Martin.
I have slides.
Very close to the mic.
Sorry? I have, you have slides up there on the thing, if you can pull them up.
You have slides in the repo?
We have time. If we don't have time, it's fine.
I don't have them.
All right. Well, while you're pulling this up, I'll talk about very quickly. Martin Zeman and I have been working on a quick interop runner that basically automates interop testing among various implementations. We introduced this at the interim and we had a couple of implementations playing at that time, and now we have a larger number of implementations. I can't remember how many we have at last count. Was it 6 or 7 implementations are now in the interop runner, and they're all working with various tests. We have, I think, managed to get most of the tests that currently are part of the interop suite in the runner. The value of using this runner is obviously that you automate all tests and people are exporting their implementation, so you can run against anybody's implementation at any point in time that you want. It generates logs, it generates various things that you can look at for debugging purposes, and we encourage those who haven't yet put their implementations into the runner to please go ahead and do so. That's about it. I was going to show a chart that it produces, a matrix, but that's yeah. And there's if you have any questions about it, please write to me or to Martin. There's also a Slack channel that you can join.
What's the Slack channel?
Quic Network Sim, I think it's called.
Okay.
Yeah, Quic-Network-Sim.
Great. Thank you. I think that's all we have. So we'll close the meeting. Hopefully we'll see a bunch of you in Zurich, or if not, there in Vancouver. Thank you very much.